Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. I'm Kenny McBride and I'm joined today by two guests joining us from home. On one side here we have Craig Berry from the SNP Common Weal group, and on the other side of me we've got Joyce McMillan from the Scotsman. And how are you both today?
Good, yep, well as could be expected.
Excellent. Well, our first story, of course, is the coronavirus. A total of 13,133 tests have been concluded in Scotland so far. 11,888 of those have been confirmed negative. 1,245 have been confirmed positive, which is 186 new cases. And 40 patients, sadly, have died in Scotland so far. First of all, how have you both been coping with the isolation part of things so far? Craig, I'll come to you first.
Well, as an introvert, I think it's quite good for me. I mean, you just got to take it, don't you? It's quite a struggle sometimes for some people to be on their own. I mean, I know some people personally that deal quite bad with mental health issues, and some people that work with people that have mental health issues, and it can be quite difficult for them in this period. But again, this isn't the situation that we're in, and we just need to make sure that we're still communicating with each other as much as we possibly can. If we can't do it face to face, then again, reaching out to some of the older people that you know and making sure they're all right.
Yeah, and Joyce, how are you getting on?
Well, I'm a freelance journalist. Basically, I work mainly for the Scotsman, but I work from home, and I always have. So I've been doing home working for the last 40 years. So it's not a kind of change of lifestyle for me as much as it is for some other people. I notice that people who aren't used to home working, particularly the ones with young children at home, are really audibly stressed by it, when you're talking to them on the phone and everything. But on the other hand, it's still a very different world out there. When I do venture out for my daily constitutional or for a wee bit of essential shopping, it's a very strange feeling. And last night I had a totally traumatic experience of ordering a curry through a Just Eat outlet and having all the little, all the little notifications that it was coming, and then it just never appeared. And I thought, surely this is the end of days, So it's quite unsettling when you live on your own and you've got to have everything in place, to sort of keep your life going, and suddenly the systems that you've depended on just start to kind of fold up like that. It's quite strange. But yeah, I suppose I'm kind of, and me and a lot of self-employed people like me are relatively used to this solitary way of life.
Yeah, well. As you say, there are some people who have got different challenges. It's good. It's good that you're keeping sane, though. That's the most important thing. On the subject of testing, as we said, that's 13,000 tests that have been concluded in Scotland so far. But organisations like the World Health Organization have said we really need to be doing far more testing. The likes of Germany has kept its death rate incredibly low. They've done hundreds of thousands of tests. South Korea and China both have been praised for their testing regime. South Korea in particular has managed to kind of level off its new cases through this really intensive testing and tracing process. Do you think there's more that we should have been doing, Joyce? Do you think we've taken the right approach, or do you think we should be taking more of these tests if possible?
Well, I suppose it's a short phrase, take more of these tests, but you can only do it if you've got the wherewithal to do it. I heard the First Minister answering questions, whenever it was, 10 days ago was the last time I heard her, and she said that all the labs in Scotland, there's 3, can at the moment, with the type of tests that we have available in Scotland, can do 750 a day. Well, that's fine. In normal times, you wouldn't need any more capacity than that for testing for various infectious diseases. But in this case, it's just like a tiny drop in the ocean of a population even of 5 million. In Germany, they've tested 500,000 people, which you've got to remember is still only a fraction of it's only like 1% of the population. I mean, it would take them nearly 3 years to get through their whole population at that rate. But it seems that it's just that order of magnitude bigger that it's enabled them to do the tracing out and down of contacts, which is the way that you can really kind of nip an epidemic in the bud. And although they have quite a high number of identified cases, it seems to have helped them. Well, it helps them statistically anyway, because they know about more of their cases, and that keeps their death rate looking low. And we really will not know until the end of the epidemic how low the death rate was in relation to the real incidence of the disease in places like Italy and the UK, where we just haven't had as much testing. I mean, I'm sure they're all trying to roll out tests now, but it does take time, and you just need the capacity to do it, and we didn't have it. And that Germany must have just had higher capacity, sort of latent. And it does raise huge questions. Both this issue and the issue about intensive care places does raise questions about the tendency that we've had really over the last 40 years almost to run public services for efficiencies. You know, people are saying, oh, we're looking for efficiencies all the time. And efficiencies means not doing things that you don't absolutely have to do. Well, you don't absolutely have to prepare for an epidemic when there's no epidemic. If you don't, when there is an epidemic, you can't deal with it. Yeah. So we're going to see a lot of talk in the kind of aftermath of this about the resilience of public services to emergencies like this. And is there a case for running them at higher than the capacity you always need in case of emergencies?
Yeah, and Craig, as I said, we've got these international comparisons. The WHO has said we should be testing more, but we heard from down south, I think it was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in England saying that this testing was for less developed countries than Britain, that Britain didn't need to do this kind of thing. What did you make of some of that kind of language that we've had coming out of government?
I mean, it's an understatement to call it ridiculous. One of the problems that developing countries have is that they don't have the infrastructure to test these sort of things. So that's why their numbers, well, potentially that's why their numbers are so low, because they don't have a clue, even more than we are, where the virus is and how it's affecting their peoples. Whereas Scotland, we could be doing a lot more. We could be testing significantly more than we are. My wife is a nurse that works in ICU. She hasn't been tested. She's worked with patients who has been potentially they were tested for coronavirus to see because they had the symptoms, and after a while they turned out to be negative. But that entire time, the days it took them to figure out if they were positive or negative, my wife wasn't tested at any point. I mean, that's just one example. This is happening across the NHS. We have ICU nurses that should be getting tested constantly. One of the things we keep on getting told is that we don't really know what the number is, how many people there is in Scotland and the UK that have coronavirus. The reason that we don't know that is because we don't test enough. That's one of the things that Germany is doing really well. They're constantly testing, they're constantly looking to identify where the virus is, constantly testing the people connected with that, and then they can identify that's what it is and we can isolate that. But again, problem that Western countries have in comparison to say South Korea, that's doing very well, we are too focused on what this is going to do to the markets, where they're more focused on what this is going to do to the people. We're too focused on, I mean, we're talking about, we're going to wait 3 weeks and then see what's going to happen, and then perhaps people are worried that the further this goes down, the market's going to crash more and more. We've had a sharper decline in the markets in the 1929 Great Depression, and that's without even saying the word recession yet. Things in terms of our economy are going to get worse. Things in terms of the people that are infected, perhaps the people that are going to die, which is a horrible thing to say, things are going to get worse. We need to do the investment. We need to invest in the things that we need to invest in. We need to build more ventilators. We need to prepare for these sort of things. But we were already, before this virus came about, talking about how the NHS was at breaking point. So that tells you that this problem isn't just a problem right now. This is a problem that is lasted for quite a while, to be honest. That we need to invest properly in our NHS, and we need to have a socially planned economy. We need to understand the things that we need to invest in, so that if these things do turn up, there's a quicker turnaround, so that we can be more prepared to do the things that are necessary and not have the worry of what's going to happen to the markets, be more worried about what's going to happen to the people.
Yeah, and the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, Dr. Catherine Calderwood, has said that they are ramping up testing, especially for frontline staff like your wife. How is she doing, or how are the staff holding up? Do her and her friends feel like they're getting anything like the support that they need?
I would say at the moment no, but I think it is something to point out that I think the other day we had at 8 o'clock people go outside in their streets and clap to the NHS horns. I have a few friends at first that thought, oh, that's quite ridiculous, no, I'm not going to go out there and clap. And I've had other people that thought, oh, no, that's quite nice, it shows a lot of respect. What really kind of brought a tear to my eye almost was my wife coming back that night. She was driving home at the same time, driving home with the window down and hearing the noise that people are really showing respect to the NHS, the respect that people have for frontline key workers. I mean, it's really shows you what we value in our society, what we value in our economy. I think that a lot of people, they all know that they need to be tested. They all know there's a lot of people that feel like they're in the dark, and once they get tested, they know that, right, okay, now I know I'm safe as of right now, as it stands right now, and then they can move forward. There's the worry that things are going to ramp up. As I said already, the NHS is already at breaking point. They're worried that things are going to expand, things are going to get worse. And their concern is about patient care rather than themselves. They're worried about the patients that are looking after right now that don't have coronavirus, what's going to happen to them. Yeah. And I think that we certainly need to look out for as well.
And Joyce, Craig raised quite an interesting point there about how we decide what we value, and I think that's something that's really come out of this whole crisis, is that people are starting to reassess how the whole economy is structured. Things like just-in-time ordering at supermarkets. People are bothered that there's so much fragility in that system. And obviously the health service, a lot of people are now saying, well, maybe we don't look after our health service workers well enough. Do you think there's likely to be a lasting change here?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can only hope so. I mean, we've been living through really an ideologically absurd time, particularly in the UK and in the United States. I mean, really, not since the mid 19th century, and to some extent not even then, have we had such a widespread acceptance among the kind of, decision-making classes of a very extreme idea of market capitalism, which kind of doesn't really see any need to have regulatory structures that are strong enough to modify it very much. And the sort of complete rejection of that has led to a kind of worship of people who acquire wealth, no matter how they acquire it, and no matter how sort of, how meaninglessly they acquire it through inheritance. It doesn't say anything about them. It's just where they happen to be at the time, and unfortunately, quite a lot of contempt for a lot of very hard-working people who are not wealthy and who are not well paid, but who are actually holding our society together. Now, in that sense, this crisis is a really important reality check to a politics that had gone off on a fantasy ideology for the last nearly 40 years, and had then, when that began to break down and was visibly not serving large numbers of people very well anymore, had turned to the fantasy ideologies around things like Brexit, Make America Great Again, build a wall, all of that sort of just classic right-wing nonsense, distraction nonsense, sort of creating artificial enemies so that people be angry with them and not with the system, all the rest of it. Now, this is a reality check to that, in the sense that we can now see that the people who are really important in our society are people like health workers, care workers, cleaners, the people who protect our actual public spaces from, from all kinds of infection and viruses, and the people who work in the food chain, who are some of the worst paid and most abused people in the whole of our labour market. People who work in supermarkets, stacking shelves, and people who work in agriculture, whose absence now from the sort of picking fields and so on is likely to run us into a really serious food supply crisis at some stage during this. So, these are the people who really hold our society together. And so it makes you think of old-fashioned phrases like the dignity of labour. I really hope that this crisis will give these people back the self-respect and the dignity that they should always have had, so that they can fight for their rights and never take no for an answer anymore. A lot of people in the British labour market, since it became so casualised, have been terribly abused. 0 hours is a terrible abuse. It really should be illegal. And yet so many people have just been sort of resigned to putting up with it. And I just hope one consequence of this is that they won't be so resigned anymore, and that they'll have a lot of public support in fighting for a better deal.
Yeah, I think the public support is certainly there for a lot of these workers. I think a lot of people now are noticing, as you say, with cleaners especially, that's, as you say, one of the lowest paid jobs, but right now, especially in hospitals, the most vital, in my view. You will just have seen it popping up on the screen there, our Twitter. If you want to join in the conversation, you can always do that. Use the hashtag #FoolScottish. We'd love to hear what you've got to say about all of these topics we're talking about today. And Joyce, on the state of the health service, we obviously have limited numbers of ventilators, limited number of beds and whatnot. We're also seeing shortages of protective equipment for staff. Is this a question of just the health service not being able to match this capacity in normal times? Is this something that we just have to accept isn't possible? Or is there a case for government doing a lot more in future to be prepared for these kind of crises?
Well, oddly, I think both of those things. I mean, this is a crisis, the kind of shape of this virus, the way that it works, and the fact that it's transmissible for so long before people get symptoms. So it's very, very hard to stop it from spreading. It probably was a crisis that was going to stretch any health service, no matter how well organised. And I think it probably will stretch all the health services in the Western world. But I mean, if you imagine what's been going on in our public services over the last 40 years, this constant language of austerity and cuts and austerity and cuts, very rarely examined for exactly why we're making those cuts. There's just been this assumption that it's a good thing to keep tax low and public services on a kind of strict budget. And actually, the amount we spend in the UK as a proportion of the economy on public services is now just too low. You can look at all the most successful countries in the world and see that they have, successful in terms of human development and all the indicators, and see that they have a higher proportion of their money spent on the public sphere. So we've just not been spending enough. And there's a whole generation of administrators in public service now, and this goes from the arts to the health service and far beyond, whose only experience is of trying to cut budgets. They sit round tables and they say, what can we do without? And if you don't have a pandemic going on, then obviously you can do without that cupboard full of extra gowns and masks. You can say, why don't we use that for something else? Why don't we not, if we have a small epidemic and we use some of them, why don't we not replace them? You're looking for the odd £1,000 here and the odd £1,000 there that you can tick off your budget so that you can balance the books. And that's been going on and off, with a brief respite during the early sort of Blair Brown years. That's been going on and off for 40 years. So we don't have the cupboards full of extra equipment. Now, having a lot of extra ICU units is another thing, and probably nobody will have enough ICU units for this. But having, basic emergency supplies of things like gowns and masks, I would say is an essential, and I really hope it's a mistake we'll never make again, that we don't have that,
Yeah, and Craig, is your wife, is she finding that the capacity at the moment is still coping?
At the moment, I think things are okay, because things are like, we don't really have an idea of where we are right now. But as it stands for her, things are okay. But I think it's important to point out quickly that we're not just facing one crisis right now. We're facing multiple crises. I mean, we have 7 major environmental crises. We're talking about say for instance, food supplies. The fact that we're worried about having people out there working the fields or doing whatever we need to do to kind of have that flow of food into our houses. It could put more pressure onto businesses to invest more into automation so that these things don't happen further down the line. Mm. And automation itself is its own crisis. So this is a crisis pushing on more crisis. So one of the things that we really need to consider is that we have a highly ideologicalised leadership of our country right now. Boris Johnson is very ideological when it comes to his investment and his spending. Once he starts to admit that we need to plan a lot more of our economy, that we need to do certain investments into our economy, that kind of lifts the kind of facade of their whole ideology, that we need to start planning more if we are to get to where we need to be, if we're supposed to fight these crises. The exact same goes for the environmental crisis. We need to invest a lot more in the things that we need to invest in so that we can have a zero carbon economy. Mm-hmm. I think maybe an interesting analogy is to point out that when you go out as a meteorologist and you say tomorrow there's going to be a meteor to strike the Earth, it doesn't change the fact for you just saying that whether that meteor is going to strike the Earth or not. That's science. That's what science is. We have mathematical models and all that sort of stuff for us to understand that. If you are, say, the head of the Federal Reserve in the United States, and you were to come out tomorrow and say, look, tomorrow the financial markets are going to crash, what would happen? The financial markets would crash. Mm-hmm. The economy isn't a science. Economics isn't a science. It is a social construct. And we need to, I think, when we had people going out to buy toilet paper, when we had the beginning of the crisis, it wasn't necessarily because they needed toilet paper. It was a human thing. It was a social thing. I seen someone buying toilet paper, and then I would think, well, why are they buying toilet paper? Maybe I should go buy some toilet paper as well. Mm-hmm. The person sees I'm buying toilet paper, he's buying toilet paper, maybe I have to do that as well. So then it goes and goes and goes. Yeah. That's the way our economy works. I see that very important person is very good at the economics. He's telling me that the markets are going to crash. I'm going to pull my money out of the economy to protect my assets, and then someone else sees that's happening, and it cascades further down. One of the wisest things we can do as, say, head of a supermarket is to limit the amount of toilet paper that people are taking, so that we can have a decent supply of toilet paper for everyone in society. It's the same can be said of our economy, that we need to know that we need to put restrictions on our economy so that we can make sure that things work in the long run, so that things work for more people. It would be terrible for the supermarkets to say, well, let's just have a free supermarket and people can just take out whatever they need to take out. It wouldn't work out like that. We would have nothing in the supermarkets, we would have people starving. We would have crisis leading crisis. Mm-hmm. And that's something that the UK leadership need to understand. But they're not going to understand that because they're not really interested in what needs to help people. They're interested in what needs to help their people. Just the small group of people within that have a lot of money in their pockets. I don't want to say the word elites, but that's essentially what I'm leading to. I think that we need to get together. We need to understand throughout the UK and throughout Scotland what problems we have and where ideologies lie. And if those ideologies if people are more concerned about ideology than actually helping people, then we need to confront that, and then I think that's something that we need to do.
Mm-hmm. And you raised the issue there of the multiple issues that we're facing just now. Obviously, the environmental crisis is one that had been getting more and more attention up until the last few months, when we've just focused on nothing but coronavirus. Do you get the feeling that once we come out of this, there will be more of a focus on that kind of resilience, on things like a well-being economy? Is that something that you think there is now space to talk about, now that people have seen where kind of all this focus on a financialized economy has got us?
I think from this point forward, things have changed. And however long this lasts, the more things will change. There will be people always interested in protecting their assets over protecting people. That's always going to be the case as of right now. I mean, that's exactly what neoliberalism was all about. Protecting, using the private sector, using the state to protect the free market. We need to make sure that we do lead to that economy that looks after people, and the only way for us to do that is to go out and talk to people about this, is for us to have these conversations. I think that the more the state has to get involved in protecting people, then the more that creates a hypocrisy. That allows us to go out and say, look, if we're able to do the things that we need to do to protect the NHS within the coronavirus, with the crisis of the coronavirus, why can't we do that for the environment? Mm-hmm. If we need to change our productive capacity to produce more ventilators, why can't we change our productive capacity to produce more, say, wind turbines? So I think it shows up to say that the importance is for us to get together and talk about it and put it in context that actually means something to people. They go to working class communities and say, look, this is what's happening and this is what we need to do. We need to make sure that what we need to do protects them as well. We can't just move forward and just talk about this perfect work brilliant for middle class communities. We need to talk about how to. I think we just need to talk about all these crises and some of the things that we need to actually do to resolve them. And that means going out and that means speaking to people. But obviously, we can't do that right now. So we have to do that within the capacities we can right now online.
Yeah. Okay, now some news came out today. So the Intensive Care National Audit and Research Centre has done some research into ICU in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And they found that the mortality rate for coronavirus patients in intensive care is about 50%. This is only, as I say, for England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have contacted NHS Scotland for figures for Scotland, but sadly, I mean, they're pretty overwhelmed just now with all sorts of media requests, and they've not been in it as the weekend as well. They've not been able to get back to us with that. This 50% though, obviously that's not the end of it. There are still a good number of people still in intensive care. Joyce, what do you make of this survival rate? Do you think? And obviously, we're also going to have to deal with this. There are still going to be new cases coming in. The numbers are still rising until the effects of this social isolation takes effect. How worried are you about capacity getting overwhelmed in the way that we've seen in places like Italy and Spain?
Well, I think the fact that we've seen what happened in Italy and Spain has maybe given us a little bit of space to prepare, just because we're slightly later in the epidemic's progress across the world. And also Scotland is slightly later than London in the epidemic's progress across the world. And obviously we see a huge amount of media from London about what's happening there. So I do think we've maybe had a little more time to prepare to get together whatever substitutes we have for ICU, beds with respirators and so on from accident and emergency departments and sort of put them all together in one place and try and organise a little bit in a way that, I mean, I think Italy was just, so unfortunate, a terrible shock wave, and nobody knew how it would play out in a Western society until they saw what happened in Italy. And of course, they're paying a terrible price for that. But also their medical people, despite all they're having to do at the moment, are making the effort to try and reach out to their colleagues in other countries and say, look, prepare this way, do that, try and fend off the worst of this. So I think, we may be slightly better prepared. As far as the patients in ICU are concerned, I think people have to really keep this in proportion. Of the people who get this virus, who we know have got this virus, and that's saying nothing of the ones that have it and don't show any symptoms, or have very slight symptoms. Of the people that we know have got this virus, it seems about 20% might need to go to hospital. Of the 20% who go to hospital, maybe about a quarter will need more intensive care. And even less than that, so we're talking maybe about 4% of the known cases that end up in full ICU. And so they are by definition by far the most serious cases. And if half of them can be saved, then that's probably quite an achievement for the staff of those ICUs. I mean, there does seem to be unfortunately, a very small proportion of sufferers from this who get a kind of overwhelming reaction to the virus, which is very, very difficult to treat. They're the ones that end up in ICU. And I really think people shouldn't get over anxious. I mean, a figure like 50% sounds terrible, but only a tiny proportion of people who get this at the moment will need anything like ICU treatment. And that's with the virus as it is just now. I mean, it could come back in a different form later, but at the moment, that's where we are. So it's a tiny proportion of people who get it who will need that kind of care.
Yeah. And Craig, I mean, as I'm sure you know, the survival rate in ICU is not particularly high at the best of times. People are in ICU because their lives are in immediate danger. What do you think of obviously, you can't know everything just from talking to your wife. She's not got a 360 degree view of the NHS UK wide. But what do you think of the way things are being done slightly differently in Scotland? We've got these community coronavirus hubs being set up. We have seen that so far the death rate overall is slightly lower in Scotland. Again, that may be an artifact of the numbers of tests we're doing and whatnot. What do you think of the way that the health service is operating in that sense?
I think that from my understanding, things are going they're going okay right now. But it's not about doing okay. It's about being prepared for what potentially could come. So we might well be in a position where certain places are doing better than others, but it's ensure that the NHS is well prepared for any eventuality. So when we're talking about some of the things that we need to do in regards to manufacturing ventilators to make sure that these things are in place for the people that need them, we also need to do a lot of training for nurses to make sure that they're prepared for the ventilators coming in as well. We need to make sure that we have, there's things we could talk about in regards to the entirety of the NHS about moving some of the jobs that exist right now over into the NHS and retraining people to use their skills for the NHS and use that for a foundational aspect of our economy. So I think there's still plenty that we could do. I think we need to be prepared for a lot more. But as of things right now, I think we're in a good setting right now. We could be better, but I think if we're willing to put the money in and we're willing to reorientate our economy towards these sort of things, then we'll be able to get out of this mess a lot better than we are right now. That just depends on how the governments are going to respond to this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's also worth saying that Scotland did start this crisis in a slightly better place than the NHS UK-wide, or the NHS in England, certainly. Well, probably all of them, actually, because roughly speaking, it is the highest performing NHS across the UK. And that's because of decisions, which you can quibble with. You know, I mean, there's been a terrible starvation of local authority finances in Scotland, for instance, over recent years, and local authorities here have become very disempowered because of decisions made by successive governments, really, but the SNP government since 2007, and SNP-led governments since 2007, but one thing they have done is invest a bit more in the NHS. So we started this crisis with, I think, unless these figures had changed in some way, but they're the most up-to-date ones I could find, with like just over 4 hospital beds per person in Scotland, and only 2 per 1,000 people in Scotland, and only 2.5 hospital beds per 1,000 people in England. So there is a difference there in the basic sort of running level capacity of the NHS in Scotland. It's not great. It was facing all sorts of crises, as were the NHS, you know, systems all over the UK, but it was just a little bit more robust at the point where it started, and had a little bit more capacity, you know, resilience to this kind of crisis.
Well, when we talk about resilience, one of the big concerns has been our food supply chain. We're hearing a number of issues going on across the country. Farmers' markets have more or less all shut down. And we're also seeing, we had somebody on from the Clyde Fishermen's Association on Wednesday, talking about the struggles that the fishing industry is facing. Most of their boats are tied up just now, and several of the processing organisations are really struggling because there's been no particular support offered to them, apart from what's been offered to all businesses. And Craig, as you were talking about kind of planning the economy, and you know, I mean, there's a lot of phobia about this idea of a planned economy. People start thinking of the USSR. But when it comes to things like the food supply, these are kind of national security issues in a lot of ways. What do you make of how that system looks under these kind of crisis conditions?
Well, I wouldn't say too much like the USSR. I think we just need to be a bit realistic about some of the things that happen in our economy. We have a foundational economy. The basic levels of services that we have, so transport's part of the foundational economy. It's stuff that we all use, and we all know that we use, but some parts of it are privatised, and some parts of it are semi-nationalised. The NHS is always under attack from different aspects of, say, the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats or the Conservatives. I think that we just need to be a bit realistic about some of the things that we need to do. We need to have, we all value the NHS. We were all out there clapping, showing respect to the people that work at the NHS. Why can't we have that aspect, the NHS and other parts of our economy, understand what's foundational to our economy, and then support it? We don't have to have an entirely planned economy. Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't have private businesses, but it's to say what are the things that we need? What are the things as someone in our society needs? What does someone who works, who lives in a working class community, what services do they need? And how can we supply it to them? How can we make sure that everyone in our society is living a fair and decent life? So we have to take a look at some of the foundational aspects of our economy. We're all happy for healthcare. We're all happy for healthcare to be nationalised, but let's start talking about our energy systems. And once we have a nationalised energy system, maybe we can start doing a lot more investments to make it a decarbonised and nationalised energy system. I think I heard recently that Scotland only owns one wind turbine out of a significant amount. It's quite ridiculous, the situation that we're in. I think there are, although I'm within the SNP and an SNP member, I think there are certainly criticisms to be made of our government as well, with all due respect to them. When I think from the programme of government we heard last year, that we heard there was about, I think there was £3 billion worth of investment supposed to be made in decarbonising renewable systems. But what that actually means is that we're going to sell off £3 billion worth of renewable assets. That's that's not investment. I think it's important to understand that there's other countries that, say Nordic countries, that realise the importance of having nationalised services for certain things. We have something called an interconnector, a big cable that lies that is going to be put in underneath the North Sea from Scotland to Norway, so that we can supply energy to mainland Europe. It was previously owned by five companies. Four of those companies were nationally owned companies in Norway and Sweden. The fifth company was SSE. The four nationalised companies turned round and said that we are not interested in having infrastructure as important as this under a privatised company. We are not interested in working with the SSE. So the SSE had to pull out, and then I think 3 months after they pulled out, SSE was fined for dodgy dealings it had with its customers. Other countries realise the importance of the foundational economy, and I think at the end of this crisis, we'll have that understanding that these are the things that are important, these are the services that we need, and we need to make sure that they're fully funded, and we need to make sure that they are able to combat any crisis that's coming down the road, and that includes climate change.
Yeah. And Joyce, on this question of the food supply, as you said, your curry didn't turn up the other night.
I don't think that was because there was no curry. The curry was floating about in some other part of Edinburgh.
We've heard like supermarkets where people have been ordering food and finding that their delivery wasn't available for 2-3 weeks. I've heard a couple of stories on social media of even quite big, Tesco or Asda or whatever deliveries not turning up. Like, and you can survive if your curry doesn't turn up, but if you're somebody who's not well, who's housebound, and your whole big shop doesn't turn up when you've already been waiting for it for weeks, that's a real crisis. How concerned are you about this fragility that we see in especially our food system?
Well, very concerned. I mean, I've just stepped down as the honorary president of Scottish Environment Link, which is the sort of umbrella group that links all the big environmental organisations in Scotland. I did that for 4 years, and I learned a huge amount about the whole business of how we abuse and use the land, in the Western world. And undoubtedly, one of the things that is going to come out of this crisis, I think, is a re-examination of the fragility of these long supply chains that we've become used to. That we're absolutely depending on green beans arriving from Kenya or somewhere. I mean, it was never going to be long-term sustainable anyway, with the climate crisis coming and the pressure there's going to be to reduce the amount of flying that goes on. But really, I think the big supermarkets are going to be in shock over this. I mean, the way that people have raided their shelves and just run away with all the produce, and the way their supply chains, even if the food supply production wasn't under threat from people being off sick and all the rest of it, even if the production wasn't under threat, they just couldn't. The distribution just couldn't get the stuff into the supermarkets fast enough. And I've talked to supermarket staff who just looked in shock at what had happened. I was in the big Tesco at Corstorphine on the evening of Saturday the 14th of March, which was really the big weekend of total panic buying. And I was with a friend who had to go in to get a special thing for his wee son, which he fortunately was able to get, a kind of non-allergenic milk. But it was, it was astonishing what had happened to that place. And I think they are really going to be thinking harder about having more local sources of supply, about their own robustness in the face of a crisis, about how they can sort of construct systems that survive this sort of incident a bit better, and all of that. But that's for the long term. In the medium term, we're going to face actual problems of food production having slowed or halted because of people being off, or because of the lockdown making people's industries unviable. And heaven knows how governments that have no experience in running food ministries or the kind of things, that we had in the 1940s, heaven knows how they will deal with that. I'm really worried about that. And then just in the immediate term, there is this huge problem about home deliveries. I mean, you cannot get a home delivery of groceries in Edinburgh at the moment unless you're in the vulnerable category, and even then it's difficult. And that puts people like me, who live alone, who's in good health, but who is in my 60s, not really supposed to be going out, not supposed to be doing risky things like going to supermarkets, and yet, where naturally, there's a chance of picking up some virus, and yet I just can't get my food any other way. So the option of home delivery, which I've been using for 20 years, just isn't there for me at the moment when I need it most. And that's not their fault. They couldn't anticipate this crisis any more than governments could, but it does show a problem with relying on big supermarkets to run your food supply system. I mean, essentially, they're actually very impressive organisations in a lot of ways, but they can't do it on their own, not in a crisis like this.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, we have seen some of the supermarkets, in fairness, I think we should credit the supermarket workers who are facing lots of people every day, and without a lot of protective equipment. They're just out there on the front line, getting paid very little, and we should show them a lot of credit. But we've seen a lot of businesses showing either the very best of themselves or the very worst. We've seen companies like Wetherspoons and Britannia Hotels in particular, two of the ones that really stuck out to me as having shown themselves up very badly. But we've also seen some other companies trying very hard to do the right thing. We've seen some companies taking on staff, lots of companies promising to retain staff wages, keep staff wages at 100%, not just the 80% that the government is covering. Craig, what do you make of the companies that we've seen in this crisis? What do you think the response is going to be afterwards to some of these companies that have chosen to profiteer, to abuse their staff, to do really, in some cases, really outrageous things? What do you think the reaction will be after this to the way these companies have behaved?
We'll remember their names. Once this crisis is over, we'll know exactly who those people were and how exactly they potentially could have done. If they go forward and do what they claim that they want to do, and they aren't fined for it, and it does lead.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
If it does come back and we find out that they have led to this crisis as well, we'll recognise them for the disgusting characters that they are. I think that's the best way to say it. These people are toxic to our society. And as I was talking about, the foundational economy, we understand that these are some of the things that we need. These are some things that we want in our economy. We want to make sure that this standard is set. I mean, do we need people like Mike Ashley in our... do we need him? Is he providing benefit? Yes, he's providing jobs. But, I mean, we can still make investments in... the Scottish Government can make investments into different things and provide jobs. I mean, when we are talking about the... talk about the Green New Deal and some of the things we need to do to combat the environmental crisis, we're struggling to find the actual supply of people rather than the supply of jobs. Mm-hmm. It's such a significant amount of work that needs to be done. So, I mean, if people want to go down and get their socks from JD Sports or whatever they need to do, I'm sure they can get it somewhere else. Mike Ashley can he can leave. I'm not interested in that are toxic to our economy. I think that, and if our government isn't going to do anything about them, then we need to put pressure on the government to do something about them. We need to say to people like Boris Johnson, you cannot allow people like this to go forward, and if they do go forward, you need to fine them, and fine, when we're talking about fines, we're not just talking about these kind of ridiculous fines that you get, say, the Scottish Conservatives got for their dodgy dealings at the last election. I think that we need to have proper fines. We need to have proper things in place that can punish these people, because that's exactly what they need to do. They need to be punished for committing these sort of things. It's beyond ridiculous that they're allowed to. I think Mike Ashley tried to claim that GD Sports was an essential service.
Yeah.
What actually is an essential service.
I know we can't have computer shops, but we're going to put up with him. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Joyce, another organisation that's come in for some criticism over their dealings with it through this whole crisis, and especially this week when they announced that there were going to be no more breakfast bulletins in Scotland, is the BBC. What have you made of media coverage, particularly from the BBC, of the crisis so far?
Well, I made the mistake of tweeting about this, and I forgot that the very words BBC and Scotland together in a tweet are enough to unleash, the furies of hell. For a lot of people in the sort of Yes movement, it's become a symbol of what they see as unfair treatment. But that actually, in this instance, wasn't what I was on about. I mean, for a long time, I did eventually become a Yes voter in 2014, but for a long time before that, I was a kind of UK reformer, and one of the things that when we were campaigning for devolution and all that, and one of the things that was key really to that was to have the BBC as the national broadcaster actually recognising all the different regions, investing in them properly, and paying due attention to them. And what I think has happened in this crisis with the BBC, it's not so much anything to do with the work that the BBC journalists in Scotland are doing, not at all. I mean, there are some very fine people in the BBC in Scotland. It's to do with the zero profile that issues to do with Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland tend to get in the main sort of bulletins that most people watch. So you'll be watching something, they'll be talking about the government, and they mean the UK government. They'll go on and on about kind of the domestic politics of Downing Street, and then they will give you a lot of coronavirus information and interviews and vox pops and interviews with frontline NHS staff, which are all about NHS England. And actually, as far as people in Scotland are concerned, some of the information that's contained in that about what the NHS is doing or trying to do is just not accurate. It doesn't tell you how the NHS in Scotland is trying to deal with this. And they don't flag up. They never say, if you're in Scotland, some of these details will be different. Go to our BBC Scotland service for more information. They never do that. What? Sorry?
No, go on. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So there's a real problem there in this instance where the NHSs do operate differently in the four parts of the UK, and even just from a UK good governance point of view, leaving aside the whole issue of independence for the moment, it's just useless. I mean, it's a very poor performance. And occasionally they do get little news stories, a little segment in the news which comes from Scotland or Wales. I heard one about the very high rate of, so it's not nobody's doing anything and there's never any mention. There will be a mention, but actually the biggest Scottish story on Radio 4 News in the last 24 hours has been that Alistair Jack has got the coronavirus. Well, as a one-line story, but it's not, or might have the coronavirus. I mean, it's a one-line story, but it is not giving the people in Scotland the vital information they need about how the NHS here is tackling it, you know?
Well, that, of course, is why Broadcasting Scotland exists, is to try and provide some of that balance, to be a Scotland-centric broadcaster. But just before we go, there is one other story, not coronavirus related. The Alex Salmond verdict came out recently. He was acquitted on all charges, but today and throughout this week, we've seen several stories in the newspaper that have certainly skirted close to defamation, to basically saying, well, we know he's guilty, really. Joyce, again, what's your feeling on the way the media has handled this story? I mean, we don't probably need to go into the rights and wrongs of the trial, but what's your feeling on the way the media has handled the story?
well, obviously the way the media handles it varies. Is the kind of story you can't expect the media not to, not to enjoy in inverted commas, in the sense that it's a very high profile figure, some very scandalous accusations, and for those who are interested in beating up the SNP, a chance both to kind of beat up one of the ex-leaders of the SNP, and at the same time to suggest that it's going to cause terrible, terrible divisions within the SNP, this whole thing, which it may do. I mean, it is certainly going to run and run, and there are quite strident calls for Alex Salmond to be restored to his membership of the SNP from some quarters in the party, and all of that. And all of that is being very thoroughly covered in the media. Mm-hmm. The voices of the women are being heard, particularly in the Sunday National today. So, I just think it will, it's a dispute that will rumble on for a long time. I mean, if I had to make a long-term prediction about it, and I mean, looking 5 years from now, I think it will seem that Alex Salmond, by this stage of his career, was basically a kind of yesterday's man with a lot of attitudes that come from the 1970s and early 80s, not from the 21st century. And, whatever the truth of the detailed allegations was, he was clearly behaving in a way that some women found inappropriate, and anyway, he's not the leader anymore. The party itself has moved on from the time when Alex Salmond was leader, and has a lot of new members who have never been members under his leadership. So, it is a different time. But at the same time, the First Minister's close association with Alex Salmond will become problematic as this thing is investigated further, I'm sure, and how far those problems will go, I'm not in a position to say. But I mean, for those of us who remember Alex Salmond in his prime, as it were, the whole thing has been very, very sad and quite distressing. And I've actually tried not to know too much about the detail of it, because it is so unpleasant, and because I think that women who make these kinds of allegations should be believed, but I also know how much Alex Salmond was able to contribute at one point in his career, and I just feel divided about it and very sad about it, and I know that the whole discussion of it will continue.
Yeah, and Craig, just very quickly, what's been your feeling about the media's response to the coronavirus, to this Alex Salmond story? What's your views on the media just now?
Well, I'll split it into two. So first, just to say how the media respond to this. A lot of people on the left tend to say that the BBC has a right-wing bias. A lot of people on the right tend to say that the BBC has a left-wing bias. A lot of people in the independence movement say that it has a British bias. The BBC has an establishment bias, and I think it's important for us to understand that, because once Scotland becomes independent, we need to understand that Scotland has its own establishment, and we will have our own forms of BBC in Scotland that have their own establishment bias, and we need to confront them. We always need to confront them. To move on to the Alex Salmond thing, I think that one of the most important things that people don't talk about in this is that when there is a split in a party, often people don't pick a side, often people drop out. My worry is that people are going to look at this, two sides, perhaps, I don't know what's going to happen, but perhaps if two sides are flinging mud at each other, people in the SNP, ordinary members, people working from working class communities, they're going to look at this and just drop out of politics. I'm not interested in having these sort of discussions. I'm out of politics. I'm not going to talk about that. People want to talk about policy. People want to talk about strategy. People want to talk about how an independent Scotland can achieve a more progressive society. I think that the SNP Common Weal group is there to make sure that people can continue to have that conversation. So if things do get rough, which they may well do, they might not, they might do. If things do get rough, I want people to know that we're still here and we're still willing to talk about policy. We're still here, we're willing to talk about strategy. I think that's certainly a criticism we have had of the leadership, that they've not really had too much of a conversation about strategy for independence. That the membership need to have a voice within the SNP. They need a prime mover, a vehicle that can give them that voice, and that's what I think the SNP Common Weal group is. So let's start talking about policy, let's start talking about strategy, and whatever happens with the outcome of the salmon trial, that's what will happen, and we will react accordingly.
Yeah, well, that is what Broadcasting Scotland is here to do. We tried as hard as we could to not get involved in commenting too much on the trial. As we say, he's been acquitted on all charges now, so we have to accept that and move on. There are still obviously issues to address, perhaps within the party. Those are going to be investigated within the party. And obviously, our system does still need to deal better with women making accusations, even allowing for this verdict. There's always going to be improvements that we can make in the justice system. But that is all we've got time for today. I'd like to thank both of our guests for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk to both of you. And we'd like to thank you at home for joining us as well. It wouldn't be worth making these programmes if we didn't have an audience, so you are the most valuable part of the whole of Broadcasting Scotland. We would ask that if you are able to support us, that you do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. You can see the address on the screen just now. If you sign up as a supporter there, your £5 a month can make a huge difference to providing another voice, maybe a voice that doesn't have that establishment bias and a voice that is more Scotland-centric, as we were discussing there. If you're not able to support us financially, we do understand, especially right now, times are very tough for a lot of people. So if you can't support us financially, please don't worry about that. The shows will always be free to view online, but you can support us in other ways. You can follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. You can find us on Facebook, and from both of those, you can share the shows around. Let people know why you watch Broadcasting Scotland. Let them know what Broadcasting Scotland is, what we do here, and let them know that we are here so that we can help to build up that audience and become the kind of broadcaster that Scotland deserves. And finally, if you're able to contribute in some other way, whether that's as a journalist, as an on-screen presenter, as a guest on one of these shows, if you've got some expertise to offer, if there's some other skill that you can offer to Broadcasting Scotland, then please do get in touch with us. We would love nothing more than to be able to start producing a breakfast bulletin to replace what we're not getting from the BBC. And if there's somebody out there who's willing to get up in the morning, pull together a show, then we would be delighted to talk to you. But that is all we've got time for today. So just once again, thanks to Joyce McMillan, thanks to Craig Berry from the SNP Common Weal group. That is all we've got time for. We'll be back tomorrow as normal at 7. Gordon will be here for Scotland at 7 then. But until then, I've been Kenny McBride. Have a great Sunday.